I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. The only weekly, serialized sword and sorcery podcast in all of the sundered worlds. SKALD is unique. Not just because of the bizarre, brutal, psychedelic subject matter, but because I do each and every episode in one single, flawless take. This is the 7th episode of SKALD's 7th cycle, which sounds to me like a great place to dive in. Afterward, once you're foaming at the mouth for more of the only story that matters, you can go back to the earlier episodes via podcast or YouTube. You can pick up the prose volumes from Amazon, or you can just wait until next Tuesday when I'll release a brand new episode of the only story that matters. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 103. The Nim hung tightly to the wall, his long, powerful tail whipping around his legs. He pressed his lean, fur-covered body close to the stones, close to the tower, trying to make himself flat, the better to avoid the wind, to avoid those powerful, unpredictable gusts that would so love, that would relish the opportunity to force him from the wall, to force him out into the open, into the void, where he would fall endlessly, to dash himself upon the rocks below. The Nim allowed a smile to creep across his face. Not a smile of joy per se, but a smile of enjoyment. Because this was what the Nim loved. This was what he prized and sought out more than anything else. A challenge. Difficult, but manageable. An opportunity to prove his power, to prove his strength and agility, to prove above all else his worth. That long, thick tail swayed back and forth, ready to provide a counterbalance, ready to help him combat the effects of those unpredictable, inevitable gusts of wind, the ones that sounded like the howling of children, the cries of babes, the ones that attempted to weaken his grip as well as his resolve. But his grip and his resolve, they were one in the same. They were unbreakable. They would not be denied. With his face pressed against the tower, he released his grip with one hand, and he slid it upward, feeling the rough stones with the pads of his paws, moving slowly, searching for a new hold, searching for anywhere that he could dig in his claws and continue his slow, interminable ascent up the tower. As he searched, as his hand felt its way upward, then to the right, then back to the left, a mighty gust of wind came, a gust of wind that seemed impossibly to wind around him, to squeeze between his outstretched arm and the rest of his body, to attempt to pry him from the tower. But the Nim was prepared. The Nim was ready, and instead of panicking, instead of swaying with the wind, instead of allowing his grip to be loosened, he swung his tail in to the wind, doing as he always did, as he always must, leaning into the challenge, the threats, the trials, and the tribulations that assailed him. The wind was cold, it was frigid, but it did not bother the Nim. Though he wore nothing but a pair of breeches, though he wore no shirt, no hat, and not even a pair of shoes, he was not cold. He did not shiver, because the Nim was built for colder climes. He was built for harsher weather than this, as his body was covered from head to toe in fur of a deep, vibrant orange, a color that had been otherwise banished from that world, a color of vibrant life, of undeniable vitality. His fur was thick and long, and it was his pride. It was his everything, because it warmed him and it cooled him, because, most importantly, it announced him. It proclaimed his presence as something to be heralded and rejoiced. No. Those howling, crying, weeping winds did not shake his resolve, did not break his grasp upon the tower. They would not, they could not. But the howling of the wind wasn't the only noise that found its way into the Nim's large, twitching ears, the ones perched atop of his broad, fur-covered head. No, there was something else. Something loud and growing louder. Something born to the wind but separate from it. Something he had heard before and had wished, had hoped to never hear again. A screamer. He knew better than to turn and look. He knew what would happen then. He remembered what would happen. Remembered what had happened to his small, idyllic village. It happened to his parents, to his family, to his tribe when the screamer came. When he had, hoping to be brave, hoping to be strong, hoping to prove his worth. When he had ignored his mother's pleas. He had ignored the chieftain's orders, and he had looked upon the screamer in all its unnatural horror. It froze him. It stunned him. It petrified him, and it shook him to his core. And as a result, he could do nothing. He couldn't raise a hand to stop it as it tore his village, tore his tribe, tore his family to pieces. No, he knew better than that now. He had learned so much since those days, since he was a child. Now he knew that he could not gaze upon the creature, that he must not gaze upon it, that it mustn't even look at it as he killed it, as he slaughtered it, just as it had done to his tribe. The Nim knew that he could not look upon the screamer, and he also knew something else. He couldn't resist it either. He must not resist it, because the screamer, upon its flapping wings, the ones he struggled to push out of his memory, this was its domain. This was its home. It was in no rush. It could swoop in and attack at the most opportune moment. And if he simply tried to resist, simply tried to hang on to the tower, to continue his journey upward, he knew inevitably, eventually, that he would fall and be dashed upon the rocks below. So he prepared himself. He brought his extended arm back in. He allowed his tail to sway back and forth, faster, faster, building to a rhythm that only he could understand. He tensed his muscles. He prepared himself. He prepared himself, without looking, to attack, to strike, to pounce, and though he could not see, though he, in fact, clenched his eyes shut, sight was no longer necessary, because he could hear the screamer fast approaching. Suddenly, with no warning, with no further thought, the Nim, his eyes still clenched shut, he sprang outward from the wall, sprang outward from the tower, pushing off, releasing and turning in an explosive burst of action, a series of individual motions performed so quickly as to look like a single one that sent the orange-furred creature launching out into open air, completely blind. And as he arced through the air, as he flew closer, ever closer to that shrieking screamer, he sent his right hand grasping once again, sent it searching, but this time not for a handhold, not for a chip in the mortar or a missing stone. No, this time it was searching for something else, searching for something that was oh so precious to him. The flattened, curving blade that he wore belted to his side. As the Nim laid his hand upon that weapon, that wide, simple blade, as he found it exactly where he knew it would be, exactly where it must have been, he collided with something. In midair, he collided with his unseen target, the creature that he could not bear to look upon. He collided with the screamer, which, struggling to right itself, struggling to stay aloft with this lean, vicious creature clinging to it, fluttered and screamed all the louder. But though the screams pained him, though they threatened to burst his eardrums out of his head, the Nim did not pause. He had no time to waste as he, still blinded, still with his eyes clenched shut, as he wrapped his left arm around the screamer's long, twisting, flailing neck, as he wrenched it back and bound himself to the beast, making sure that if he were to fall, if he were to be dashed upon the rocks, so too would be the screamer. The screamer arced and turned, trying anything, trying everything to buck the Nim off of its back, to free itself from his long, corded muscles, the ones buried under piles of that thick, luxurious fur. But it was no use. The screamer was only effective when it attacked from above, when it swooped down, when it chose its battles carefully, when it was the one on top, the one in control. And now, the screamer was none of those things. The screamer was helpless, a fact that the primitive, wicked, unnatural creature realized as it felt the Nim's wide, flattened, curving blade pressed to its throat. The Nim had the screamer where he wanted it. He had captured it. He had subdued it. And now he would ride it. He would tackle this challenge like he did all others. He would use what was aligned against him. He would catch the stones flung at him, and he would send them sailing right back. He was not the strongest, not the smartest, not the fastest or the best, but the Nim had one thing above all else to work in his favor. He was flexible. He could adapt. And so he did, changing his plan in the seconds it had taken to launch himself at the screamer. And now that he had captured his steed, now that he had broken and dominated it, all that remained was for him to steer it upward, to guide it to the window that was still so many stories above him. But to do that, he would need his eyes. He couldn't risk looking upon the screamer itself. He couldn't risk the fear, the overwhelming sense of the unnatural, the sense of the otherworldly that would overcome him if he gazed upon the creature. But without his eyes, he could never steer it to the window, could never steer it to his destination. As a matter of fact, he couldn't even hazard a guess as to which direction the tower lay in. So frantic, so confused, so erratic had the screamer's motions been since he seized it. No, he would have to open his eyes. He would have to. But he would have to keep them raised upward. Would have to keep them pointed at the gray, stormy skies above, at the clouds of ashes that still blotted out the sun, that still made the world cold and dark, that made it a place for him. For the Nim. So, after cinching his left arm tighter, after squeezing so tightly that the screamer's voice was diminished, that it was barely able to breathe, much less let out those piercing cries, the Nim braced himself. He took a deep breath. He raised his head upward. He craned his neck. He rolled his eyes practically into the back of his head. And he opened them. All he saw was gray. All he saw was grim, lurking death, inevitable death and decay, and he was filled with joy. Because he stared straight upward. He stared at the sky that had damned and forgotten all of that world's inhabitants, just as the gods themselves must have done. He'd avoided looking upon the screamer. He had avoided losing everything that he had fought for. He had avoided becoming petrified, becoming frozen, and then falling down, 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 to be dashed upon the rocks below. No, he'd avoided all of that. And now it was just a simple matter of locating the tower, of directing his mount, the flying steed he could not dare to look upon, of pointing it toward his goal. And so that is exactly what he did. Careful not to look down, careful not to gaze upon the screamer he sat astride, the one he held with an unrelenting death grip. He swiveled his fur-covered head back and forth, searching for the tower, searching for the window, searching for his goal, searching for where he must travel, for where he must go. And soon enough, found it. He laid eyes upon the window. It was behind him, 20 yards back and some 50 above. He allowed himself another smile. The stupid, unnatural abomination, the screamer, it had unwittingly carried the Nim even closer to his goal. It had already, unbeknownst to the monster, begun to help him. So the Nim felt even more confident that he could steer the beast, that he could take it exactly where he needed to go. Keeping his blade pressed to the creature's throat, that long, sinewy neck that, with the threat of the curved machete, had ceased its thrashing, ceased its twisting and turning. The Nim wrenched the creature's neck upward, chasing it with the blade, pointing its croaking head up in the direction of the window. And the screamer, it had no choice but to obey, no choice but to follow the Nim's commands, but to ferry him upward, up, 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 rocketing up the side of the tower, flying directly toward that massive open window. The screamer tried to fight it, tried to veer away, tried to shake the Nim off of itself, but every time it flew off course, every time it disobeyed, the Nim would remind it. The Nim would give it a potent, bloody reminder of who he was, of what he could do, of his power, of his strength, and of his worth. The Nim would nick the creature's throat again and again until the blood ran down his furry arms and he felt the creature's wings begin to slow. The Nim smiled once again. No, this time, he laughed. He let out a sardonic, wicked cackle because of what he knew, of what he recognized. He didn't need the screamer. He didn't need anyone. But he would use them. Of course he would. He must. And why shouldn't he? Everyone else did. Everyone else looked at their cold, gray world with the cynicism it deserved. And why should he be any different? No, he was no different. He was no different except for one thing, one important thing. He was better at it. He could be more cynical, more conniving, more flexible, more adaptable than anyone. So as the screamer, as still it climbed upward, as it felt its lifeblood drain out of it, as its vision began to darken, as its speed began to slow dramatically, the Nim made a decision. The Nim decided to give the screamer the same mercy that it had given his family. He would give it a painful death. He would give it a trip into the inky black void of nothingness that awaited them all. The Nim, still taking care not to look at the creature, knowing that it had its horrifying properties even in its dying moments, even after death, he forced the creature's neck down. He wrenched its head downward, pointing it straight ahead, pointing it straight at the tower wall, as though they were not yet to the window, though they were still a few yards below it. The Nim had come oh so very far by himself, and he would go further still yet. He did not need the screamer. Not now, not ever. So he steered it toward the wall, toward the tower, smashing against those rough, magic-infused rocks, braining the frantic, dying creature in the process. And as it flailed, as those wings beat their last, as it struggled with its underpowered limbs to hang on to the wall, to find purchase, to save itself, the Nim, in a series of motions so quick, so fluid that they seemed impossible, seemed to be but a single act, he delivered one final, decisive slice to the creature's neck, and he reached out with his left arm, releasing the dying creature, and instead reaching out to retake his hold upon the tower. The Nim, quickly sheathing his blade, that curved machete, he felt the screamer's presence disappear, heard its final scream echo from below as the creature fell, as it fell down, 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 and was dashed upon the rocks below. With a smile still plastered on his face, the Nim took a deep breath and set his tail swinging once again, that ever-ready counterbalance. Then climbed upward. He reached out his paws, left and right and left, again and again and again and again, moving quickly but conscientiously, working to find the most secure handholds, working to find the best place to dig in his hardened claws, and soon enough, he had arrived. He was there. He found himself at the window. He allowed his smile stretch wider, knowing how effective it was, how frightened his foes always were of his sharp, pointed teeth, especially when shown in a mimicry of friendliness. Then, expecting better, expecting easier, he pulled himself up. He hoisted himself up into the window, knowing exactly he would find there. The wizard was already hard at work. His spell was already underway. The Nim was no expert. He had no desire for such profane knowledge. He could tell that the wizard had already set about his ritual, had already set about his summoning at least a week prior. And as the Nim dropped down into the room, as he once again reached for that wide, flat, curving blade, he could tell that the wizard's spell was working, could tell that it was progressing, and that if given any more time, if allowed to complete it, the Nim did not wish to think about what would happen, just as he did not wish to name what the wizard hoped to call forth. Nim, crouching in the stance in which his feline form felt most comfortable, he began to prowl forward, to move silently upon padded, fur-covered feet, to advance upon the entranced wizard and his gleaming metal altar, piled high with wicked tomes and glowing screens. And at the center of the altar lay the source of his power, the focal point of his nefarious energies. The Nim would kill the wizard. He would stop the spell, and he would take the wizard's focus. He would seize it so that no other could lay their hands upon it. But as he advanced, as he prowled forward, as he prepared to leap at his prey, the wizard's eyes focused, and he spoke. "Now, my darling." The Nim felt a crackling of energy on his flank. He heard a sparking anger, and what he saw filled him with rage, filled him with fury that anyone else, that anything else would dare to stand in his way. He whirled to face the monstrosity, to face the circuit golem, that mess of humanity and wires and metal and lightning and magic, the one that had laid hidden from the Nim's vision, but now charged across the wizard's sanctum, letting out a pained cry of static and anguish. Thanks for listening to the very best episode of SKALD yet. I love reading your reviews on the show. It's a way to give you, the SKALD fan base, a chance to be heard, a chance to flex your own writing muscles and hear them read by me. And it's also a way to encourage people to go leave reviews of their own. But there's a problem. I'm almost out of them. After this episode, there will be no new reviews to read on the show, which is going to put us in a very, very awkward spot next week. Please, help me keep this tradition alive and go leave a review on iTunes, like a Virginia gentleman did. A primal story for evolved listeners. Like the bardic sagas of old, SKALD is about rhythm as much as words, about performance as much as language. The more you listen, the more the rhythm will capture you, and the deeper you will fall into the nihilistic yet compelling quest of Maul, the barbarian, the shattered hero, the breaker of worlds, the one true king of men. Aubrey Sitterson's delivery is hypnotic, by turns powerful and emotional, a perfect complement to this twisted tale. I guarantee that you will love this podcast, but be warned, once you start listening, you won't be able to stop. This episode of SKALD, like every episode of SKALD, is brought to you through the support of my Patreon donors. By going to patreon.com/SKALD, you can help support the only story that matters with just a few bucks a month. But if you want to give more, you can get some amazing rewards. If you're willing to drop $10 a month, for instance, you can get a shout out right here on the show. And you can use that shout out for practically anything. Your social media accounts, a podcast, a blog, a book you've released, a charity, or even just a band you want people to check out. It's totally up to you. Plus, you'll also get all the rewards from the lower tiers. To sign up, to show your appreciation for the only story that matters, go to patreon.com/SKALD today. For more information on me, the SKALD Prose volumes, my comic book writing, signed copies of my work, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, my bio, contact information, social media, and more, get yourself to aubreysitterson.com. This week's recommendation is a movie that I just saw, but due to the recording schedule of this show, may very well be out of theaters by the time you hear this. But hopefully, it's not. Because if you haven't seen it already, I highly recommend that you go see John Wick 2 immediately. Personally, I think you'd be better off having seen the first one, but it's not really necessary. Because it's a smart, intense, gorgeous action flick that does some incredibly impressive world building, all while keeping its murderous main character, played by a, quite frankly, awesome Keanu Reeves, shockingly likable. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.